Hi everyone. My name is Alexander Zalivako, and I'm the founder of From A to Z law firm. One of the areas of our expertise are sanctions, and in a series of presentations called Sanctions 360 Degrees, we will look into major sanctions economic regimes and the way they affect the lives of private individuals and corporations. Thank you very much for watching.
We will discuss in this video current international and national economic sanctions with respect to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or the DRC, and we would follow the following structure. We would first look at the DRC from the sanctions perspective. We will put it into the historical and political context to explain the current focus of sanctions and those areas which are of a particular risk from the sanctions perspective for those companies and businesses which invest into the DRC. Then we will provide a short overview of the UN sanctions and major national economic sanctions regimes. The DRC is probably one of the most important participants in the international economic chains and in addressing current goals standing in front of the international community, being climate change. The reason for this is that the country has the largest world deposits of cobalt and coltan, which are the key components in the production of electronic vehicles or microelectronics, for example, cell phones, and accordingly are important in the advancement of those technologies, as well as generally the basin of the Congo, which primarily flows through the DRC, has the second largest world rainforests after the Amazon, which protection and preservation is again key for the addressing of those environmental objectives which currently the humanity faces. But in addition, the country is generally very rich in the natural resources. The south of the country, close to the border with Zambia, so-called copper belt of Africa, with the second largest world copper reserves after Chile and Peru. The country equally has vast deposits of diamonds, tin, zinc, as well as substantial deposits of gold. Unfortunately, these riches also act as a source for revenues for those militant groups which operate in the country and create a very strong incentive for destabilization in the relevant regions, which we'll discuss in a second. From the historical and political perspective, what is important for the understanding of the current sanctions regime is to appreciate that, unfortunately, the country is one of those regions which has suffered from historical colonial legacy, being the colony of Belgium. The colonial regime in the DRC was probably one of the most violent, to the extent this comparison would be appropriate for colonialism in general. The country was purposeful and developed. In essence, the country was subject to exploitation in the worst possible sense, with the result that no infrastructure and no social institutions were left once Congo gained its independence. And unfortunately, following the independence in 1960, the situation has not changed much. The country became the battlefield for the Cold War major powers. Patrice Lumumba was assassinated following the coup. The president who came in his position, Mobutu, was notorious primarily for corruption and nevertheless supported by Belgium and the United States due to his opposition to the Soviet Union. The resulting change with Kabila family has not really improved the situation, so the existing weak institutions holding colonial power unfortunately became even weaker, which for a huge country like the DRC, which in terms of the territory is the second largest country in Africa, meant that the central power was able to exercise very limited control over the entire territory. Nevertheless, this historical background has been subject to a very important development in middle 90s, which has its roots in another tragedy in the region, the Rwanda genocide, and the exodus of persecuted or the persecutors from Rwanda into the DRC. First Tutsi minority, which was subject to mass murder in 1994 when genocide unfolded in Rwanda, left the country for neighboring Congo, where it formed various militias groups, the most famous being FDLR, but there are many others. And then once the militant government of Hutus perpetrating the genocide was overthrown by the Tutsi militants coming from the neighboring country of Uganda, then the Hutu perpetrators fled the Democratic Republic of Congo and again formed various militias groups in the region. Given the richness of natural resources, we can see on the map that the natural resources of the DRC are primarily concentrated in its eastern part. This certainly created a very fertile ground for their exploitation by these militant groups, and by doing so, by providing the revenues for their existence, operations, and expansions. But it would be also fair to say that this type of political connections and this type of origins with neighboring countries also resulted in often quite profitable business of, for example, refining gold or coltan or cobalt, which was extracted in the DRC and then exporting these metals to the wider market. So we can see here that officially there were two wars in the DRC during this period of time, but it's not that the periods in between were really peaceful periods. No, these are the periods when the official wars officially ended, but de facto militia on the ground continued its constant military strikes against the civil population living there. And in essence, it would be fair to say that over the last 30 years, Congo really knew very, very short periods of peace in its eastern part. And even today, the area is subject to ongoing and constant violence caused by various militias operating in the region. So it would be fair to say that international and national economic sanctions with respect to the situation in the DRC are fairly aligned, and they are largely focused on the matters which the sanctions are purported to achieve: the restoration of peace and security in the region. So on the example of DRC, whether successful or not, at least we can say that in principle the sanctions framed in a way to achieve the purposes they are supposed to achieve. And at the UN level, The arms embargo was imposed with respect to militias groups as early as 2003 and continues to be in place. And in essence, the arms embargo prohibits the provision of any military equipment or military training or other type of military support with respect to any militia operating in the region. It's noteworthy that the embargo does not apply to the government of the DRC, and in 2005, the regime of providing arms to the government of the DRC has been even further facilitated with the prior notification to the UN Security Council of any such supplies being abolished. In addition to the arms embargo with respect to militias operating in the region, the UN economic sanctions focus on designating to the US asset freeze and travel ban lists those persons who are in essence responsible either for undermining peace process in the eastern part of Congo or are responsible for various types of criminal activities committed in the region, like human rights violations, perpetrating abuses against civilian population, recruitment of children in the militia, exploitation of natural resources, or exploitation of wildlife, as well as attacks on the UN peacekeepers or expert missions, which unfortunately frequently happen in the region. Looking now at the key national sanctions regimes, the US, the EU, and the United Kingdom, we can see here uncommon alignment between those regimes and with the UN economic sanctions in general. All three programs, in essence, aim at the implementation of the UN economic sanctions, focused on the restoration of peace in the eastern part of the Congo and addressing those root causes which allow to sustain the ongoing violence in the region, namely trading in the illegally extracted metals and other jewels. And from that perspective, the key focus of all national regulators is certainly today on the supply chain control. One of the key sources of revenues in the region is the smuggling of gold extracted in the eastern part of the Congo. And this metal, which is easy to transport and which relatively small quantity can result in substantial resources, is the primary source of concern. And from that perspective, for any company which is operating in the region or may tangentially deal with any metals extracted from the region, the focus on the complete due diligence of the entire supply chain is of paramount importance, and to the extent not observed, can result in the designation of the relevant blocking sanctions lists. Thank you very much for watching, and I trust that you found this presentation useful.